A properly sharpened chain will produce large uniform chips like these, and a dull chain will produce fine sawdust like this. When it starts getting like this, you know it's time to stop and sharpen the chain. So here's how it's done.
Rotate and inspect your chain and look for the cutter that's in the worst condition. You'll want to start with this tooth. Ultimately, in the end, you'll want every tooth on the chain to be sharpened exactly the same, and also to be the same length. If you don't, your saw won't cut properly. Make sure the chain is adjusted to be snug on the bottom of the bar rail and place your bar in a vise. If you're sharpening your chain in the field, there are handy stump vices like this that work great at holding your saw steady while sharpening.
We'll use this model of a chains cutter to help explain the sharpening angles that will be important to you. First, this is a filing angle. You'll want your file to be parallel to this angle. If you vary this angle, it will negatively affect the way the chain cuts. The tooth has a marking etched into it that you can follow. When you use the file and guide, you can see that the guide also has an angle to follow. When this angle is parallel to the guide bar, then your file will be at the correct filing angle. From the side of the cutter, you can see the side plate angle. This shows you how the cutter should look from this perspective when it's filed correctly. When holding the file, or in this case the file and guide, you want to make sure that the file is held at a 90-degree angle to the bar, and apply slight pressure back into the tooth. Tilting it up or down will negatively affect the way the chain cuts. An important component to this part of the sharpening process is having the correct size file. Too large of a file will cause a back slope, and too small of a file will cause a hook in the chain. Both have very negative consequences, so be absolutely sure you have the correct size file that matches up with your chain. When you use the file and guide, it shows you the proper filing angle as we mentioned before, and the plates on either side of the file rest on the chain components and give you the proper depth for the file and the cutter.
To begin sharpening your chain, always file from the inside of the tooth out. Cutters alternate from right-hand cutters to left-hand cutters. So, in this example, we'll begin by filing only the right-hand cutters first. When we're done with those, we'll move over to the other side of the bar and file the left-hand cutters. Set the chain brake to hold the chain in position. And file your first tooth from the inside of the cutter out, applying slight pressure back into the tooth with a smooth stroke. If your file is in good condition, you won't have to exert much pressure at all. Only file in one direction, then lift the file out of the cut to pull back. Letting the file drag on the cutting edge on the backstroke will dull the tooth. In most cases, your chain will require the same amount of filing strokes on each cutter. So count your strokes as you file your first tooth. Release the chain brake and move the chain with your gloved hand to the next cutter. Set the chain brake again and file the cutters with the same amount of strokes. Then, measure the two teeth to make sure they are close to identical in length and adjust if necessary. Once you are done with one side of the cutters, move to the other side of the chain and file the remaining cutters. Now, we're not done yet. Next, we need to make sure the depth gauge is set correctly, and this is real important. The depth gauge in relation to the cutters acts much like a hand plane. The amount of gap between the top plate and the depth gauge and the leading edge of the top plate determines the amount of chip that will be taken out in the cut. Because the cutter slopes down, as it's sharpened and becomes shorter, the chain's depth gauge clearance becomes shallower and needs adjustment. If the clearance is too shallow, the tooth will not be able to cut. And if the clearance is too deep, this can put too much strain on the chain and the components of the chainsaw. These chains is designed to work optimally, with specific clearance that controls the bite. By using your depth gauge and setting it on the chain, as we are here, you see where the depth gauge is protruding above the plate. If you file your depth gauge down to the level even with this plate, you will have the exact depth that you want for your chain. You'll need to do this on each tooth. Then, taper the edge of the depth gauge following the angle that is etched into the tooth.